And welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Ashley and I are excited to have you. And for this session, this is our first of three webinars around the Embracing Authenticity Guide. And so today we'll talk about understanding its significance and practical use. So I'm Rani Shahaz. I go by Rani. I use the She Suite, and I'm coming at you from Jacksonville, Florida. I am the senior project manager here at C4 Innovations, and my lovely colleague, Ashley Stewart.
Hello, everyone. We're so pumped to be here. Rani and I had the wonderful opportunity to work on this guide, and we're just excited to share it with you. My name is Ashley. I am the director for the Center on Equity at C4 Innovations. And my background, I also use the She Suite, and my background is on institutionalized forms of identity-based oppression. So this particular series is very near and dear to our hearts and the work that we get to do on a day-to-day basis. So we're pumped.
Very excited.
So to take us through, we're going to, do some introductions. If you're just joining us, you might have missed the prompt in the chat. We're asking that folks introduce yourself in the chat. It's really nice to see your remarks coming in. We're supposed to share your name, your pronouns if you would like, where you're joining us from, and your favorite thing about this time of year. So you'll see some folks in the chat are talking about, snuggling up, or in places where it's warmer, some of the cooling down that might be happening. So if you haven't had a chance to introduce yourself in the chat, please do so. Then we're going to go all over the objectives of today's webinar. Towards the end of our session today, we'll also have the opportunity to talk about the next two webinars and what we'll cover in the content there. We're going to emphasize what the significance of this workbook is, what it is, and how folks can intentionally use this workbook. And then we'll leave some time for some questions from folks. Yeah. And to kick us off, I'm going to, Tracy, me too. Me too so much. I love lights. So these are equity-centered trauma-informed best practices. This is a list that I've kind of curated throughout over the last 5 years or so, things that have worked particularly well. Many of them you're probably familiar with or have seen before. But what I'm asking of folks is, as I go through them, not only are they things that people can use in the workplace to help to facilitate equity-centered conversations and to be trauma-informed in critical conversations, they're also things that we're asking for folks to think about in our sessions today and across the next two sessions. So what I'm going to ask for folks is, as I read them and give some context to them, let us know in the chat which ones stand out to you or ones that you particularly like. And if for any reason you have a question about one, I also ask that you put that in the chat too. So the first is to expect a lack of closure. It's a journey. I love to say I don't put bows on things unless it's this time of year, because then I put bows on everything. But in terms of sessions, right, we don't put bows on things. We recognize that sometimes we might leave, especially when we're talking about something like authenticity in the workplace and microaggressions in the workplace. We're going to leave with additional questions, additional curiosities, and that's indicative of a really good and critical conversation that we're having. So we expect a lack of closure, acknowledging and recognizing it's a journey. Ask for clarification. 38 of us in this room, 38 different places. You can see the very diverse geographic emphasis that's in this room. But in addition to that, we've also have really different lived experiences. So how we talk about things or how we address things could look really different. And so asking for clarification is a really great way to stay engaged in the conversation and to have difficult conversations. Embrace discomfort. Discomfort is a natural part of growth. And a lot of times even the term discomfort is associated with something that is negatively associated, but there's discomfort in growth. And so we want to embrace that and be able to feel it and recognize it when it comes up for us and see that it is an indicator that we're leaning into a conversation that is important and essential. This work is not for others, it's for us. Especially this one's really important as we think about this workbook, because some folks could take something like a workbook and say, here, you need to do this, and put it to someone else and delegate it to someone else to do or to engage or to use as a resource. But really, this is about work for all of us to do. And so we like to name that up front. honor all experiences and expertise. There are a lot of different forms of knowledge. A lot of times when I talk about expertise and experience, people think of expertise as people who have studied something in a capacity, and experience being lived experience. In this context and in this space and in the work that we do as C4 Innovations, expertise, we consider lived expertise to be a critical form of knowledge. And so we want to uplift and honor lived experience in this room as well as folks who have a particular interest or a studied knowledge of information as well. Safe space and brave space, some things that Ronnie talks about or feel really brave for me and might feel really safe for her, and vice versa. And so we want to acknowledge that there's often times where we can experience both safety, but also bravery in engaging in these conversations. My absolute favorite is revisiting welcome. And this comes out of my work as a clinician, as a mental health provider, really studying different types of forms of cognition and processing. And so we have some folks who during the session today, thoughts, ideas, questions will come up for you. As we go through the slide, you'll raise your hand, you'll join us in the chat, and we welcome you very, very much to do so. And then there might be some other folks who your point or your thought or your question might come to you on slide 30, or maybe tomorrow or 2:00 in the morning when you're trying to sleep. You're like, I wish I would have asked this. I want folks who have that sensation in your body to know that this is a culture here where revisiting is welcome. I don't care if we are on slide 15 and you want to come back to something on this slide, we will always make space for that, because we honor and acknowledge that all processing types are essential to this conversation. And so even if it's something that comes up for you a day or so later, know that we'll have the opportunity to come back into this room together. And please do bring it up. No missed opportunities to talk through anything in this space. Affirm and give credit. We want to hype each other up, support each other. I've been teaching online for much, much longer than probably most people. So back in the day, before you had all these emoticons and things like that, I used to just put exclamation points in the chat, and people thought it was so like innovative at the time, but now you can literally like emphasize something that someone writes. So I encourage you to use the chat. There's no amount of conversation that's going to be distracting to us. So we welcome you to use the chat actively, to affirm, to give credit to one another, and to have critical conversations as we go through our conversation today. For Evoke Expert Positioning, kind of just looking at the roles that you all have and are joining us from, a lot of folks are put in a position to have answers all the time. And this workbook is really about sitting back and creating a space for learning to revoke that expert positioning. In this space, we want to listen to understand, listen to be present with one another. That's really essential. Sometimes the goal or objective can be seen as agreement, but really it's about curiosity. And so we want to create a space where we can be curious and engage. To be accountable for the impact of our words or actions. We might say something and intend for it to land one way, and it lands a completely different way. And in those instances, it's really important to be accountable for our impact in words. Another one of my favorites is accountability is kind. Now, this is a critical reframe. This workbook is about authenticity. It goes into some critical dimensions of systemic and structural oppression. It does. And so, a lot of times we might be tempered in going into those conversations because maybe they haven't gone so well before. Maybe many of us are afraid of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, and like the call out culture has people on edge. I'd like to reframe it and say we're all in this space because you're coming to talk about embracing authenticity in the workplace, people showing up as their truest self. That is the absolute baseline that we have and we share in common. So accountability is actually coming from a really kind place because it navigates from that critical assumption and navigates from that critical evidence that we have. And so instead, if I'm sharing something along the lines of the context of this and it doesn't land the way that I intended to, or maybe I use a term that is inconsistent with that goal of wanting people to embrace authenticity, and Ronnie tells me, that's a very kind thing to do. It's kind for a multitude of reasons. It's kind because it's kind to me because it navigates from the assumption that I'm here to enhance people's ability to embrace authenticity. It's very kind of Ronnie to do that because it takes a lot of courage to let someone know, hey, Ashley, I know that you really care about embracing authenticity. when you said this, it actually probably decreased the likelihood that someone will feel comfortable to share in this space. That's very kind. It's very kind. It's a very difficult thing to do. And for me to receive that with that care is also kind. The third group of people who is really kind for, or for the folks who I potentially would not harm again or decrease their ability to be authentic in a space, because it's now part of my awareness. So that accountability piece, being kind, is so essential as a critical reframe to really honor the work that we're attempting to do. So that's one of my favorites. Be gentle with yourself and others and give yourself grace. A lot of times we can look to other people to give us grace, but really there's a great opportunity for us to be gentle and kind with ourselves and give ourselves grace. And then we cannot challenge what we cannot acknowledge. So this workbook is about putting things on the table so that we can challenge it, so that we can acknowledge it, and so that we can make progress within workplaces to create more authentic spaces. So from this list, things that stand out to you, ones you particularly like, or maybe something you have a question on, you're welcome to put it in the chat or come off mute. Give folks a second.
I think the first one of the lack of closure, paired with the embrace discomfort, are two that really stand out to me. I like that closure. It feels good. So they kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, they do go really well together. Thank you, Brittany. That's such an important point. Yeah, we do. The closure can feel really good. And sometimes we create a sense of closure where there really is an opportunity of continuation. So I love that you bring that up. Yeah. Isaac puts in the chat, give yourself grace. Absolutely. That's so essential in this work. I also welcome folks, if you want to say something to me or Ronnie directly, want us to share it in the room, but you don't want to put it in the full chat. If you send it to us, we will read it without reading your name. Yeah, Amanda says, love, we cannot challenge what we cannot acknowledge. We need to keep developing our self-awareness to be present with others. That's so good. That's so good. Maybe one or two more folks. Looking through. Yeah, if anyone's unmuting. Someone says directly revisiting, welcome. Thank you. It's always nice to come back to things. It is always nice I agree. It is very nice to be able to come back to things, to create that intentional space where it's welcome and that culture is expectant that we will continue to process. Yeah, that's really great. Thank you. Okay. Awesome. And if you were typing, please don't backspace, continue to type in the chat. We want to see what you're typing. So if you are typing, feel welcome to continue. Embracing authenticity. So this is when you get the opportunity to see the workbook, when you get the opportunity to have access to the workbook, you'll notice that this is one of the images that kind of centers around the core of it, the first pages of it. And it really talks about a guide to authenticity and cultural awareness at work. And it comes from a really critical place. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of it, but as a general overview, this workbook is intending to serve to promote healthy workplace conversations. And these are conversations that are happening whether we know it or not. And when I say they're happening, they might be happening behind closed doors. They might be happening in people's homes because they're not actually happening in the workplace. But they're things that are absolutely happening, and we might be pivoting and getting around the conversations. But we want to recognize that particularly folks of color who are experiencing work-related stress, in addition to or in compoundment with life-related stress. It's a resource for different groups of people. So you'll notice that as we talk through the workbook, there's intentional parts of it that focus on the individual who might be experiencing some sort of barrier to being authentic at work. There's thoughts or thought promptings for people who observe that this is happening and want to have an impact. And then there's also a part of it that is intentionally created to have leaders think about their role and responsibility in creating that culture. So it's really an everyone in the culture responsibility to promote a space of authenticity, and that's a really critical part of it. And we wanted to make sure that it's not focusing or burdening the work of that on people who are experiencing the most systemic marginalization, but holding that piece of accountability for everyone in the culture to create a more equitable work environment and to reduce harm through practices around organizational change. So this webinar is intending to kind of give you a roadmap about how to intentionally and impactfully engage with the content of the workbook. Yeah. Denise, I love you put in the chat, it's okay to be uncomfortable, always challenging ourselves to come out of our comfort zone. Yeah. And what's familiar, educate ourselves on cultures, traditions, and challenges in the work environment that are often full of microaggressions and barriers for movement in this work. That's so good. And one of the sections will really get into microaggressions in a bit. So I'm glad that you bring that term up in that context. So the objectives of the webinar are to offer deep understanding of the origin, the purpose of the workbook, why it was created, the significance of it, why we decided to focus on well-being and racial equity in the workplace. We also wanted to familiarize folks with the structure of the workbook. If you're intending to use it for yourself or with your organization, we really wanted there to be guidance about how to facilitate and steward it. We'll look at the different sections, the appendices, to illustrate how it works to promote authenticity. We will also talk about the benefits as it's intended to serve, and to make recommendations about how you can use it as an individual or collaboratively to amplify your equity and inclusion efforts.
So how do we get here? Like,
Yes.
why did you all come up with the workbook, right? That process was really around some work that we did in early 2022. If I can get my next slide to go. There we go. So the journey here. And this really began about thinking intentionally how we can support people in the workplace. And we started with some interviews. And it was a series of interviews to gather information from employees and employers in the mental health field. We wanted to find ways to support all staff, but particularly, as Ashley mentioned before, staff of color. So we wanted to really ask some questions about people, how people maneuvered in the workplace, how they showed up to the workplace, how that helped or hindered their work. And so our conversations focused on the supports that were in place or supports that were needed for well-being in the workplace, understanding the context of well-being in relation to racism in all levels. So you're talking about individual, organizational, and societal. As Ashley mentioned before, thinking about those pressures outside of the walls of your workplace or the screens in a virtual world of your workplace, and how those impact how you show up to work and how you could be supported in that place. And then we wanted in that process to create space for very honest and frank conversations. Like, we wanted folks to show up to the interview as them whole selves, so that we can get information that will help us create a resource that folks can use. And so taking that information, we thought about how can we create something that people can use in this space that will help support their well-being. And so that's how we came up with this guide. And in doing the interview, here's one of the quotes that came out of it, and it really speaks to how we got to the point of authenticity. And one of the participants gave us this: "And I'm authentically myself. I don't switch up or change for anybody. And that's what allows me to be able to do my job. Because when kids come in and see me, they see my swag, they see my flow, they feel it, they connect. We connect with each other. And that's a big part of what we do here, because we want everyone to show up as themselves, as their authentic selves. And my job allows me to do that. And that helps me with my wellness." I was talking with one of the interviewees, and basically how he's able to wear the style of clothes that he wears and how students can relate to that. They don't see him as a person in a suit, working in, you know, the mental health field, and being able to relate to them and have authentic conversations with them. And so we can expect folks to be able to relate and have that conversation if they're not even in a place to be able to do that themselves, especially working with others in the mental health space, working with youth in that space. We really use this as a catalyst, and it really came up in a lot of the interviews that we had with folks, even in the different roles, from the higher level management to those doing direct service jobs. People really wanted to be able to show up as themselves and realize there's a benefit to that in the way that they provide service.
So good. So what are the benefits? Like, why focus on inclusion and authenticity? And so I wanted to bring in a little bit of research too that kind of set the stage for why we focus on this, right? We have the personal testimonies. That is the number one form of information that we bring to it. And then there's also some scholarship about what does inclusion and authenticity mean. And so I love this quote. It says, if an environment feels threatening, we'll tend to conform in order to achieve a sense of protection and safety. And when we're talking about conforming, we're not talking about some of these like small nuances that people will change or shift. We're talking about real cognitive energy and physical and physiological energy that people are expending to be thoughtful and considerate about how they'll show up in an environment. We're talking about people conforming absolute parts of their identities in order to increase their likelihood to be successful, their likelihood to receive promotion, their likelihood to have positive interactions in the workplace. We're talking about people repositioning and shifting the way that they stand to avoid hurtful, homophobic, transphobic comments. We're talking about people who are literally changing the way that they talk, their tone, things about their hair, their style, surface level culture, deep level culture, things about themselves in order to achieve that sense of safety and protection in the work environment. We're talking about people making really critical decisions about what and how to eat, what languages to speak. We're talking about people making decisions about to share and show parts of their faith in different spaces. And so when we're saying that people will conform to achieve a sense of protection and safety, this is above and beyond, you know, small little nuances that we might make in order to adjust to workplace cultures. When we look at leaders who take this on and who think about it critically and who are willing to look at this issue, the benefit of it tends to be more innovative conversations, organizational learning, people feeling confident and engaged because they're bringing their true selves to the workplace. This is a really big part of why we decided to take on inclusion and authenticity as part of this work. And then another quote that really that comes out of like cognition studies is, when our bodies and minds experience safety, our social engagement systems will enable us to collaborate, to listen, to empathize, to connect, to be creative, to be innovative, to be bold in our thinking and our ideas. And that positive benefit of it is to our relationships, but also to our lives in general. And so I pause for a moment to say, what do we think a work environment would look like if people could be creative, innovative, and bold? Like, how would that change the dynamic of the places and spaces we work in if people could be empathetic, connecting, creative, innovative, and bold? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat. How might that change the dynamic at work? You're welcome to come off mute if you'd prefer over typing. Now, I'm a trauma-informed educator, but I'm also not above calling on people. Just kidding. Caitlin says we might actually get into some of the bigger, harder questions and actions. That's so good. Yeah, we would. Yeah. Brittany said that's where real change and forward thinking can happen, when there's safety to express ideas and identify areas that need to change. If we're not having those conversations, can that even happen? I've noticed that when we are able to be our authentic selves, the clients see that and connect to us in ways that they wouldn't normally. Asher, absolutely. There's something really special and unique about when you show up as your authentic self and others show up as their authentic selves. I in my role in C4, I get to do this work at a very in a very macro scale. And I also am a professor. And when I teach students, I teach clinical students, I teach social work students. One of the things that's a feature, a pedagogical feature of the course is about bringing authentic selves. I remember completing my schooling and being really good at being a clinician, a provider in the way that I was taught to do so. But as I grew in my professional identity, I started to not talk so much in like my teacher voice or my clinician voice or my provider voice, and talk in my own voice. In the way that it shifted my ability to serve people was so drastic. I committed myself to teaching students to not do it the way that the textbook does it. You get your technique, you get your strategy, but to bring their real selves to it, because it was just absolutely transformative to the connection that I was able to have with people. Yes, other folks are saying, Han said it could change the type of work done at work if it doesn't serve this environment. Yeah, we could do better work with clients when we are creative in how we connect and respond to challenging situations together, Michelle. Absolutely. Judy says feeling seen and heard in the work environment is where actual change takes place. Empathy is really needed for staff and clients to be their best selves. So true. It seems to be incredibly stressful not to be our authentic selves, and this prevents us from being our best selves. Lisa, yeah, there's so many studies that show about that emotional, like decision fatigue comes from, a big part of decision fatigue can be about making decisions about how to show up as your authentic self. Yeah, Isaac serves older folks, and I'm not a cold worker with a button-up shirt, but just two people talking to see what they need most in their lives. It's beautiful. People can feel authentic and real, not wearing a mask to fit in, to be accepted, but challenging the norms, not to be politically correct or apologetic about who they are or where they come from, are true forms of oneself, says Denise. So good. As I said, that's where learning new languages and cultures, even a couple of words or facts, is immensely beautiful for people who come from those countries and speak their languages. Isaac, that's trauma informed too, right? That's addressing and challenging things like acculturative stress, which we'll get into that once we get into the workbook. But that's a big part of it. That's being trauma informed. Yeah, Trinidad says, Asher took the words out of your mouth, always trying to provide an atmosphere for people to be their authentic self as soon as they put on their clinical voice away and use their everyday voice. Caregivers and clients were able to connect more. Supervision, Amanda brings it to the space where you could feel authentically safe and to reflect. Yes. Always reminds me of another training you provided. Oh, hi, it's so great to see you. About people feeling welcome. Yep, love it, connection, Colleen. Yeah, sure. When we humanize ourselves, our clients see that, and it starts to break down the barriers between professional and client that can hinder connection. This is what's at stake, right? Like, we cannot afford to not have inclusion and authenticity in space. I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to tell you why we can't afford to do this. We can't afford to not do this, rather. So when we looked at authentic experiences, it was about the things that I covered in the quotes, but it's also about looking at those shared experiences in the interviews, the workbook, the practical tools, the actionable strategies, thought-provoking exercises that begin to address the well-being, identity, authenticity, and inclusion of equity. And the guide itself is a combination of those authentic experiences, looking at things like the quotes, looking at the actual quotes from participants to craft something that will help individuals and their employers in the mental health field who are committed to fostering well-being and supporting employees of color. I thought to bring this point home, it'd be helpful to look at some data. And so McKinsey & Company did this great study, May 2022, it came out, so really recent. Today is one of the largest research studies in terms of numbers of people and numbers of countries. So they worked with thousands of organizations, over 1,000 organizations in 15 different countries to really look at what are the benefits of like diversity in the workplace? And surprise, not probably to anyone in this room, companies that invested more in diversity outperform their peers significantly, right? And so we could see that, and it wasn't just in the financial outperformance, but when you really go through the whole study, it was in like types of folks that were being supported, the ways that services were being able to provide financial outcomes all across different metrics. But the other part of the study that was quite interesting was that even though folks said that diversity was great and beneficial and helpful, it did not equate in any way to their experiences around inclusion. In fact, that experience around diversification had an adverse effect because there was this gap in inclusion. Why do we think that people might not have felt included even in a more diverse environment? What was missing? What do folks think? Where is that disconnect coming from? Interesting finding, yeah. We put it together often. Diversity and inclusion is only an ampersand between the two. What's the real difference, right? It depends on the culture being reproduced by the people there. Having a PMP doesn't mean it's truly being applied. Yeah, right? What else? Diversity nor inclusion ensure equity, fear something being taken away from the dominant culture, potentially feeling like it's lip service. The spaces and the places that were created, we can bring a bunch of people to the table with amazing, valuable, literally uncompromisable, like diverse multivariate experiences that are informing the greatness of an organization. But if those folks don't have a space to do that work, to be themselves, to really exercise that lived experience in a place, and in fact it's not included, it is not a space of inclusion, that causes even more harm. We're bringing in people to spaces that are not prepared, into organizations that are not prepared to really not only celebrate but embrace and to create room for and to shift the culture to prioritize that multivariate diversity. So I always like to talk about starting with equity first. We start with equity first as the most central part. And if you're taking the other webinar with me, I go through this like in real depth. But when we start with equity first, it gives us the opportunity to see the gaps that exist and persist. So when we get this amazing diversity in the space, it's just not something that we checked off boxes to do, but that there's opportunities for those diverse experiences to be celebrated and acknowledged. Yeah. Holly puts into the chat, some studies have shown a lot of people have a zero-sum thinking. If someone else gains, I have to lose, and they may not be aware. And it may not even be aware, and they think it influences the way that they see the world. Yeah. Yep. That's so good. And so that's just a little bit like these are the roots of this workbook. And so now you might be wondering, all right, so you said you made this workbook. What's really in it? And so Ronnie's going to take us through the parts of the workbook.
So, as Ashley mentioned before, we wanted to look at this not just from the perspective of those experiencing, but we also wanted to incorporate things from the leadership standpoint. So how can organizations support folks that are experiencing it? How can they make conditions better for people to show up on themselves? And then for folks who witness these sorts of things, so the microaggressions, the places where you don't have psychological safety or safe physical safety because of who you are, how you present, or how you operate through the world. So being able to put together a comprehensive guide that really talks through those things that we found through the interviews, through research, and break it down for folks to use in a real way that is digestible and usable, and not something that will sit on a shelf, right? People produce things all the time and it's like, oh, that sounds great. It looks good. We look at it once and then put it away. We want this to be something that folks can actually engage in and use and refer back to and make a part of their practices, their policies and procedures, and not just policies and procedures, but things that are going into practice in the organization. So part one of the guide will focus on authenticity in the workplace. Part two is on identity and mental health. Part three will be addressing microaggressions and institutional bias. Part four is talking about prioritizing wellness in the workplace, what that looks like, how you can do that. And then part five is resources. So, we talk about all the things, we do all the things, you have exercises, but then we also give you something to walk away with that you can use and share, make copies of, and say, I'm going to map this out. I'm going to revisit this to be able to use those resources and share them with other folks in your workplace. So we'll briefly go over some high level what those chapters talk about. But if you join us for part 2 and 3, you'll get a deeper dive into those sections. So part one, we focus on authenticity in the workplace and what that means, being able to show up as your true self, and how that has really become a hallmark of being in a workplace now. Folks want to feel like they are accepted and welcomed, and their ideas are welcome. They're able to show up as themselves, so they're able to connect with those they're working with, both inside the organization and the folks that you serve, right? So what does that mean? What does that look like? What are the benefits of it? How does that improve the value, business value? How does that improve job satisfaction for those in those positions? And so thinking about authenticity in the workplace, who are you? How do you show up? And so for the group, why do you all think that authenticity is essential in a working environment? What are the benefits of that for you? And you can share out or share in the chat.
Oh, for me personally, when I'm my most authentic self, I'm gonna feel better. I'm gonna have more buy-in to what I'm doing, to the place that I am, be more engaged in the work that I'm doing, and not get as fatigued and burnt out.
Yes, we love that burnout. We talk about that in the guide as well. Burnout. What does that look like? What does that mean? And how that can come faster as a result of you having to put on a mask to come to work. And so you're like burning your candle at both ends, essentially. You're dealing with things outside the world and you're coming here and putting on a mask so you can get through the day. We have some others in the chat. Yes, masking is exhausting. It's very tiring. Thank you, Heather. When I'm the person God created, I have more energy to do the work, right? You can't pour from an empty cup. If you're lighting yourself on fire to keep other people warm, like you're gonna wear yourself out fast. So yeah, that's important. Tapping into authentic yeses and nos, yes, helps me stay centered. Yes, and realizing that no is a complete sentence. Like nothing has to come behind that. If you've made a decision, it doesn't align with who you are as a person, and it's not interfering with your quality of work, yes, let your yes be yes and your no be no. People warm to authenticity naturally as you present your true self up. Yes. And we talk about it as well. So when you show up as yourself, people come into an organization and say, you know what, I can be myself here. I see how other people are operating, and it makes work so much better. You're able to produce at a higher level because people are not like tiptoeing around like, am I going to say the wrong thing? Do I have to use a certain language in order to be able to be successful here? When people feel like they can just show up and they can express themselves and we're all working towards the common goal to bring value to the organization, to the people I work with, it just makes everything so much better. Thank you all for sharing. And then in chapter 2, we get into identity and mental health. So how do we create work environments that support identity-based stress responses? We know that stress and mental health, those are really big topics, especially in a post-pandemic era, as people think about what do I need to sustain myself? What is really important in my life, and what supports do I need in a workplace to help me support who I am and really manage what it means to be myself in that stress, and how those responses can show up and impact the way I work, live, and move. So we really wanted to focus on that. And as you get into the workbook, you will be able to see like the exercises around that and the new thinking around it in ways you may not have thought about before. So a new perspective, and then being able to support folks that are trying to support you in that space as well. So as I said before, mental health is a big thing. In every area, in every field, people are really starting to tackle that and support that. What do you all feel about the importance of mental health in the workplace. Do you feel like workplaces should really emphasize it? What do you think the role of the workplace is in the mental health for those that work in an organization and those they serve? Feel free to share out, or you can share in the chat. Yes, go ahead, Isaac.
Thank you. Oh, hello. Oh,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
we
I
can.
thought I froze. Sorry. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah. So I feel like it kind of ties into like the idea of being authentic. If you're able to be upfront about how you're feeling or just in what environment or what situation you're in at the moment, like what headspace you're in, people will one be able to be more receptive to you because if you kind of tiptoe around like how you actually feel, anybody who might be trying to support you, you might not necessarily get something that you're looking for. But I feel like if you prioritize that and you sort of stay true to that, then it just allows space for more fruitful conversations between people in the workplace. So, everybody feels welcome and it feels like we can help each other out.
I
Yeah.
love it. Thank you, Isaac.
Hmm.
Yeah. Being able to feel like you're supported and say, today is not a green day for me. It's a yellow. It's a red. Like, and how can your team support you in that space, and what does that look like? And Amanda said in the chat, I feel like organizations should take more responsibility for employee wellness and well-being so that self-care doesn't feel like a burden. And thinking about self-care and how organizations support that, and really leaning into those in the organization to say what that looks like, and not just saying, oh, we're going to do yoga for you all on Wednesdays, that'll do the trick. All right, or we're going to have somebody come and maybe give chair massages. While those are all great things, they may not speak to what I need, and things that are ongoing to support mental health of an organization, right? What are the real ways that employees say that they need, and how can organizations support that? And how do you have a continuous kind of feedback loop to say, okay, what we needed in the spring may be different than what we need in the fall and winter. The seasons change, the things that come along with that, the sadness that may be associated with certain holidays. Like, how do our organizations responsive to those needs as time goes on, and really getting feedback from in the organization and creating things in place so you always have an opportunity to tap into and lean into what you need, and have a place where you feel safe to do that. Yeah, thank you, Asher. Yeah, here's a breathing exercise. Yeah, right. Like, we're gonna count to 10, everyone. Everything's gonna be fine. Get back to work. We need some real effective mental health supports in the workplace. I worked in the medical field for 10 years before moving over to mental health. This is the first time I've ever had a supervisor that asked about my self-care and how she can work. That's important. Yeah.
Jessica, I saw you put your hand down, but we would
Yeah.
love for you to share.
No, I was going to say that in terms of the mental health piece, I think it's so important. And, I'm a supervisor where I am, and that's one of the things that I'm very well known for is the self-care of my staff. And it's funny that you guys say that, but we do a meditation several times a week at different times of the day to allow staff for a break and just to take a break away from the work that we do, in terms of, because we work with very acute dual diagnosed individuals in the community. So that job within itself can be very, burning out. You burn out very quickly, with 90% of your work is in a community, going into different places, meeting them in, on the town green or wherever they are to find them to provide mental health services. And I also think in terms of, somebody mentioned their supervisor, I think it's important. It really comes from your supervisors, and it really comes from the administrative that work at different companies, because if your mental health isn't supported, if the self-care isn't really shown across the agency, then people don't take care of themselves. So it really starts from the top and should really trickle down from the bottom. But if that's not happening, then it really creates a burnout amongst your staff if you're not taking care of each other.
Yes, Jessica, thank you for sharing that. That's so true. Leaders have to mirror that, that they're invested in that, and that it's important to them as well, and not something they just gathered up to offer to folks in the organization, but they are really showing that they are involved in it, and mental health is important to them. So yes, thank you for sharing that. It really does start at the top. Lots of great comments here. Thank you all.
Yep, so good. And you know, one of the things that I think is so important in those examples, right? There's places or spaces where we think that we can do this like once in a while, and that's going to be self-care. But the ultimate thing, and one of the things that I hear people talking about, is the consistency of it, right? If we do this thing every single Wednesday, and you can rely and know that this is going to be a space that's created, that's something that folks can trust. But when we say, oh, we're going to do this in September or at peak seasons, then what about the rest of the time, right? So when something's baked into the culture, like something that you can know is there, whether you utilize it or not, there's benefit to it. The third part of the workbook focuses on addressing microaggressions and institutional biases. So we're really looking at the conscious and unconscious stereotypes, attitudes, and beliefs that are held. Many of us know what microaggressions are. We're familiar with the term. We're going to talk about it a little bit differently, and maybe differently than folks have talked about it before. That'll be in the third session. So I just want folks to know that, like, even if you're familiar with microaggressions, I really encourage you to come, because we'll have we'll talk about it perhaps a little differently. We'll talk about how to address it. You know, I wonder, and folks feel welcome to put in the chat, do you feel like your organization or you have the tools or resources to be able to address microaggressions or forms of institutional bias when they come up? It's not just about the individuals. It is about the individuals, but it's also about the institutional biases and microaggressions that could be impacting people. Yeah. That's great, Han. Yeah. Do folks feel like you have the resources or the ability to kind of address microaggressions and institutional biases? Yeah, no.
Yeah, we actually have that in our agency. Everyone is required to take a DEI training, diversity and inclusion, and equity training. And it's a really hands-on training, and it's across, there's a lot of states that use it. And at the end, you kind of get together, and some of the information, goes back to the CEOs of each company. And then that way they can see what comes up from those trainings and try to incorporate that into the workplace. There's a lot of different things that we do in terms of address that. We have a thing called courageous conversations. It's like a training, and how do you bring up courageous conversations? How do you bring up uncomfortable topics? And how do you address that? When you experience microaggressions within the workplace, how do you express that, and how do you bring it up, and how do you allow it to have meaningful conversation so that the person who said it doesn't understands where it's coming from? It's like an ouch moment, right? To see how can we work to fix this? How can you acknowledge, just to acknowledge, because I think sometimes people make statements and don't realize they're making statements, right?
Yeah.
You don't know what you don't know. And it's just a way to really learn from each other.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I love that there's also emphasis of it that is particularly around conversations, because it can be really hard to know how and what to say or how to address it. So specifically getting skills around the conversational piece is so dynamic. I'm seeing a lot of folks share in the chat that yes, there's some trainings, but maybe there's more opportunities. Some folks are really surprised and excited because their organizations are really leaning into this. It is a really important and critical time to be having these conversations. And so, we're really excited about the timeliness of it as well. Yep, not fully integrated, exactly. The fourth section of the workbook is going to focus on prioritizing wellness. And so when we talk about burnout, a lot of times we'll talk about it at an individual level. And that is important to give people the skills and resources to be able to navigate through the intensity of some of the work that we're doing. We also focus on burnout in this context as an organizational issue, because a lot of times people are burning out because they don't have the skill or the ability to balance or navigate. People are burning out because the organization is not structured in a way that best facilitates people's wellness. And so we really take an organizational look at at burnout, which I've heard some folks absolutely like reiterate and talk about in your own experiences. So I think that that's really dynamic and cool that we're able to talk about it in that way, and really look at what a healthier work environment would look like. The final section of the workbook is looking at resources. So we have different terms. We have additional resources that folks could look at, but then there's also these worksheets. So you have a worksheet that looks at self-reflections, a worksheet that helps people identify microaggressions and address them. We have a worksheet that focuses on creating an action plan for wellness. We also have a worksheet that focuses on bystander intervention. So you're observing this, you're seeing this, how do you know how to address it? We also have some recommendations around policies, around diversity and inclusion policies. What does it look like for reporting and resolution procedures? And then some guidance around unconscious bias trainings, and workshopping around inclusive leadership. So there's some resources there that can be really helpful, just some guidelines to help organizations kind of take that first step, or individuals within organizations really take that first step to either address it for themselves as a person who's observing it, or a person who has oversight of the ability to make change at various levels. So I'm really excited about that too.
And we want it, as we said before, like we don't want this to be something that just sits on a shelf. So
No.
this book is very intentional, and it has a very deliberate approach. It has prompts, exercises that get you to thinking, and it's designed to really promote one to reflect and have a level of self-awareness, and gives you some actionable steps. It's not just, oh, reading through, oh, that sounds great, like get a couple definitions, but gives you some real actionable steps that you can follow as you embed these like practices into your daily life and your work, and are able to share these with your organization. And we understand that, fostering authenticity and addressing biases and prioritizing wellness requires very intentional focus. And so we structure the workbook in a way that supports that.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you can expect by engaging with this guide, it is going to help you enhance your self-awareness. You'll be able to reflect on your values, biases, areas of growth. Because there may be some things, I didn't know that. I didn't think about it that way. So being able to grow in this as well, and laying the foundation for personal and professional development. We're going to cultivate inclusive practices. So be able to develop strategies that challenge microaggressions, foster allyship, and contribute to a more equitable workplace culture. Prioritize wellness. So really focusing on that and creating a personalized wellness plan is one of those resources in the appendix that you can use. And that really, like we said, want to be an intentional guide. So giving you something that you can have actionable steps to create that will help support your holistic well-being. And then we want to contribute to organizational change, because it really is about the organization changing, and creating a culture where people feel safe, where people can be themselves, show up as themselves, and be able to support their wellness and mental health. So we want to use this guide as an opportunity to do that in tandem with others involved in organizational efforts, to make a meaningful shift in practices and culture in the organization. And so for the optimal use, we want you to engage with purpose. Really get into this guide and be very intentional and purposeful, and recognize that you, by participating in this process and going through this guide, are helping to create this workplace that you all envision as a future vision of a workplace that supports your authentic self, your wellness, your growth. And so it's beneficial to engage in this with others as you go through this process. Have colleagues that you can work with that really help to move this work forward together. You're not in this alone. You are not an island. So really tapping into those resources and using this as a guide to shift the culture.
Awesome. So I see that there is already a question in the chat, or an important question. And also there's just been so many dynamic comments in the chat as well that I want to spend some time really looking at. But one of the questions that came up in the chat is like, what is the connection between authenticity and microaggressions? And in the third session, we're going to dive deeply into this, and particularly how the workbook will help facilitate it. But when we're really talking about microaggressions, we're talking about a compounded experience, right? When we think about microaggressions, you think of subtle slights, discriminatory comments or remarks, intentional or unintentional, that demean a person or minimize a person's experience. And when we look at the like real definition of microaggression, that is a real definition of microaggression, but we look at the history of how the term microaggression is derived, we can get to see that microaggression is never intended to be about like the smallness of the incident, but really the compoundedness of it. So when someone is continuously being exposed to subtle forms of discrimination or backhanded comments or these really invasive forms of discrimination in the workplace, the neurological impact of that is one that creates a trauma response, a numbing response, which hinders a person's safety ability, but also like physical ability to be their full selves. And so people are adjusting and acclimating in environments in avoidance of, but also in a protective way against microaggressions, that it creates one of the greatest barriers to the ability to be authentic. That microaggressions are the subtleties that are woven in the fabrics of cultures that say, oh, if you behave in this way, I'm going to say something that is intended to be like a joke, but it's going to let you know that that's not really welcome here. Or like, oh, you're gonna really expressing your culture today at work, right? Like these subtleties, these comments, but they're very much rooted in oppressive ideology, whether the perpetrator knows it or not, or is conscious of it or not, but it's really coming from a place that has a whole lot of detriment to the wellness of another person, and thereby impacts their ability to be authentic. So if I know that I'm going to continuously hear little smart remarks or comments about how I show up with my hair or how I say things in the work environment, I'm likely just going to change that to evade that because of the convenience and wellness for myself. But there's also the subsequent health concern with doing that is a consequence to people who are often impacted by microaggressions. So we'll dive well into that, but is a very important question. Where do you download the workbook? So the workbook will be published on the MHTTC website as soon as it's published. Following this series, you will be the first folks to get access to it. Everyone who's attending will get access to the resource. It is a free resource. It's public resources. So we will be sharing that with you all, and you all will see it first as soon as it's live on the MHTTC website. And somehow, or at time, I don't know when that happened, but just to close this out really quickly, we have parts 2 and 3 coming up on November 29th. We have part 2, and then part 3, we skipped the week. And then we'll have part 3 in December, and that's when we'll really get into and dive into the content more in depth. And just to close us out, one of the things that we like to ask SC4 in partnership with the MHTTC is we like to ask folks what information are you interested in. So if there are other topics that you'd hope to get training on or opportunities to learn more about, we ask you to just put them in the chat. You can put them in as a storm cloud in between the thank yous and the closings out, and we'll find them. But we want to hear from you. What other topics would you be interested in learning about? So please put that into the chat for us. Additionally, we do have an evaluation. So if you want to scan the QR code or take the link, we'll be able to get that to you as well. You'll get one following this session today. And if you need to contact the New England MHTTC, we have their contact information on this slide as well as the next slide. That will get you to where they need to be. So thank you. And I'll turn to Ronnie to kind of close this out with thank yous.
Yes, thank you all for joining us today. We really hope that we see you at the next 2 sessions where we take a deeper dive into the content of the workbooks and able to show you all some of the resources and exercises and really talk about how you can use this in a real intentional and impactful way for yourselves and your organizations. Please take the survey. Please register for the next 2 sessions. Isabel Kai, do we have any other closing business that we need to take care of from a...
No, I think we're all good. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. And if there's anything missed here, we'll circle back with you via email. If you have any questions, you can contact at the email address here.